"Step back, sir." The guard's voice sliced through the quiet solemnity of the military chapel like a sharp blade through silk. But the old man didn't budge. He stood frozen, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the casket rail so tightly that his knuckles turned pale against the polished dark wood. It wasn't just a gesture. It was a lifetime of memories, a burden he'd carried silently for decades, now manifesting in this single, desperate hold. The guard, his tone now harder, edged closer, his footsteps echoing ominously in the reverent stillness. "I said step back." The man's refusal was an unspoken defiance, a quiet rebellion against the strict order and rigid formality of the ceremony unfolding around him. To everyone else, this was a moment of respect, a final farewell marked by tradition and protocol. But for this man, it was something far more personal, a last connection to a story only he could tell. Then, something extraordinary happened. The bugler, stationed just 20 feet away and poised to play the final tribute, slowly lowered his trumpet. His eyes met the old man's, a silent understanding passing between them in that brief, electric moment. It was as if time itself paused, acknowledging the weight of the unspoken bond, the untold stories hidden beneath the uniform and medals. In that chapel, amidst the ritual and respect, the unyielding grip of one man and the hesitant breath of a bugler became a testament to a deeper truth, that sometimes the most profound honors aren't played or paraded, but felt and remembered in the hearts of those who lived them. Welcome to the Veteran Voices. Before we continue with this deeply moving story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of this community. The funeral of General Patricia Hawkins was scheduled to be a precisely choreographed affair, the kind of military ceremony that honored both the deceased and the institution they had served with distinction for over 3 decades. Arlington National Cemetery's Old Post Chapel had been selected for the service, its Gothic Revival architecture providing a solemn backdrop for what would be one of the most well-attended military funerals of the year. General Hawkins had been a trailblazer, one of the first women to achieve 3-star rank in the Army, and her death from cancer at 68 had sent ripples of grief through military communities across the globe. The chapel filled early with dignitaries, fellow officers, and family members, each taking their assigned seats according to a protocol that had been refined over generations of military tradition. The front rows were reserved for immediate family, the second section for high-ranking officers, and the remaining seats for the hundreds of soldiers whose lives General Hawkins had touched during her remarkable career. Every detail had been planned with military precision, from the positioning of the honor guard to the timing of the ceremonial elements that would mark the transition from life to honored memory. But military funerals, like all human ceremonies, sometimes encounter moments that no amount of planning can anticipate. And this funeral would be remembered not for its perfect execution of protocol, but for a moment when protocol itself was challenged by something far more profound than regulations or rank structure. The elderly man had arrived early, before most of the official guests, and had taken a seat in the back corner of the chapel where he thought he would be unnoticed. His appearance suggested someone who had once worn a uniform, but had been away from military life for many years. His gray hair was neatly trimmed, but not recently cut. His dark suit was clean and pressed, but showed the wear of someone who owned only one outfit suitable for formal occasions. His shoes were polished to a military shine, but they were old, the leather cracked with age and use. Throughout the service, he sat perfectly still, his attention focused entirely on the flag-draped casket at the front of the chapel. He didn't participate in the hymns, didn't bow his head during prayers, didn't show any of the typical responses of someone attending a funeral. Instead, he seemed to be engaged in some private conversation with the woman whose body lay beneath the stars and stripes, his lips occasionally moving in silent words that no one else could hear. The service proceeded according to plan. Chaplain Morrison delivered a eulogy that captured General Hawkins' groundbreaking career and her commitment to mentoring young officers. Her daughter spoke about her mother's ability to balance demanding military responsibilities with unwavering family devotion. A fellow general shared memories of Hawkins' tactical brilliance and her reputation for never asking her soldiers to do anything she wouldn't do herself. As the formal service concluded and the congregation prepared for the final ceremonial elements, the elderly man did something that sent a ripple of concern through the military personnel responsible for maintaining order and protocol. He stood up from his seat in the back of the chapel and began walking toward the front, toward the casket where General Hawkins lay in state. The movement caught the attention of Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, a young military policeman assigned to security detail for the funeral. Torres had been briefed on the importance of maintaining proper decorum and ensuring that the ceremony proceeded without disruption. He watched as the elderly man approached the casket and positioned himself directly beside it, his hands coming to rest on the polished wood rail that separated the mourners from the honored dead. For a moment, Torres hesitated. The man wasn't being disruptive. He wasn't making noise or creating a disturbance, but he was clearly violating the established boundaries that were meant to ensure the ceremony's dignity and order. Torres approached carefully, his training telling him to be respectful but firm in maintaining the established protocol. "Sir, step back please," Torres said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but tempered with respect for the man's obvious age and the solemnity of the occasion. The elderly man didn't respond. He didn't acknowledge Torres' presence or give any indication that he had heard the request. His eyes remained fixed on the casket, his weathered hands gripping the rail as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. His lips continued to move in silent conversation, and Torres could see that tears were streaming down the man's face, though he made no sound of grieving. Torres felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was aware that hundreds of people were watching, that any disruption would be noticed by the dignitaries and family members who expected military precision in all aspects of the ceremony. He also knew that the next phase of the service was about to begin, and having an unauthorized person standing so close to the casket would interfere with the honor guard's ability to perform their duties. "I said step back," Torres repeated, his voice firmer now, carrying the edge of command that had been drilled into him during his military police training. Still, the elderly man didn't move. If anything, his grip on the rail seemed to tighten, and Torres could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his body seemed to be braced against some invisible force that was trying to pull him away from the casket. It was clear that whatever was happening here was about more than simple protocol violation. This man was experiencing something profound, something that transcended the boundaries of military ceremony. Torres made a decision that would have been supported by his training and his superiors. He reached out to place a firm but respectful hand on the elderly man's arm, intending to guide him back to an appropriate distance from the casket. It was a reasonable action, the kind of gentle enforcement that maintained order while respecting the dignity of all involved. But before Torres could make contact, a voice from across the chapel stopped him cold. "Don't touch him." The voice belonged to Corporal James Mitchell, the military bugler who had been positioned near the chapel's entrance, preparing to deliver the final honor of taps that would conclude the ceremony. Mitchell had been watching the interaction between Torres and the elderly man, and something about the scene had triggered a recognition that sent shock waves through his understanding of what was happening. Torres turned toward Mitchell, confusion evident on his face. The bugler was stepping away from his position, moving toward the front of the chapel with his instrument still in hand, but no longer preparing to play. His expression carried a mixture of awe and understanding that Torres couldn't interpret. "Corporal, this man needs to step back so we can proceed with the ceremony," Torres said, trying to maintain his authority while wondering why the bugler was involving himself in what should have been a simple matter of crowd control. Mitchell continued walking toward the front of the chapel, his eyes never leaving the elderly man who still stood beside the casket. As he got closer, Torres could see that Mitchell's expression was changing, shifting from understanding to something approaching reverence. "That's Sergeant Major Rodriguez," Mitchell said quietly, his voice carrying a respect that made Torres pause in his attempt to move the elderly man away from the casket. Torres looked more closely at the man he had been trying to escort away from the casket. The name meant nothing to him, but he could see that it meant everything to Mitchell. The bugler approached the elderly man with the careful respect of someone approaching a monument, someone who understood that they were in the presence of something significant. "Sergeant Major Rodriguez taught me to play taps 20 years ago when I couldn't afford music lessons," Mitchell explained, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "I was just a kid then, maybe 14 years old, living with my grandmother in a neighborhood where music lessons were a luxury we couldn't afford. But I had this old trumpet that had belonged to my grandfather, and I was determined to learn to play it. Torres found himself listening despite his concern about maintaining protocol. Around the chapel, other people had begun to notice the interaction taking place near the casket. Some were craning their necks to see what was happening. Others were whispering questions to their neighbors. But the attention didn't seem to be creating the kind of disruption that Torres had been trained to prevent. Instead, it felt like something important was being revealed. My grandmother heard about Sergeant Major Rodriguez from someone at the VA hospital, Mitchell continued. She heard that he had been a military musician before he retired, and that he sometimes helped kids learn to play. So she walked me over to his house one Saturday morning, and I knocked on his door with my grandfather's trumpet in my hand. The elderly man at the casket turned slightly, finally acknowledging the presence of the two younger men who had been trying to move him away from General Hawkins' casket. His eyes were still filled with tears, but they were focused now on Mitchell, and Torres could see recognition dawning in the weathered features. "He didn't just teach me to play taps," Mitchell said, his voice breaking slightly with emotion. "He taught me why it mattered. He told me that every fallen soldier deserves a perfect farewell, that the notes of taps carry the weight of a nation's gratitude, and that if I was going to play it, I needed to understand what it meant to the families who would hear it." Torres began to understand that he was witnessing something far more significant than a protocol violation. He was seeing the intersection of past and present, the moment when a lifetime of service and sacrifice was being acknowledged in a way that transcended military regulations. "He never charged me for the lessons," Mitchell continued. "Never asked for anything in return. Just made me promise that I would never play taps carelessly, that I would remember that every note mattered to someone who had lost someone they loved. He said that the bugler at a military funeral isn't just playing music. He's delivering a message from a grateful nation to a grieving family." Sergeant Major Rodriguez finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion and decades of memories. "You were a good student, Jimmy," he said simply. "You learned to play with your heart, not just your fingers." Mitchell set down his instrument and rendered a crisp salute to the elderly man who had taught him not just to play music, but to understand its meaning. "I learned to play for moments like this, Sergeant Major. Because of you. Every time I play taps, I remember what you taught me about honor and service and the weight of saying goodbye." Torres stepped back, understanding finally that some honors transcend protocol, that some moments require flexibility in the face of something larger than regulations. He found himself saluting as well, not because it was required by any manual or regulation, but because it felt like the only appropriate response to what he was witnessing. "General Hawkins was the one who recommended me for the music program," Rodriguez said, his voice stronger now. 40 years ago, when I was just a young sergeant with a talent for music and no clear path forward. She saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, and she made sure I had the opportunity to develop it." The pieces of the story began to fall into place for Torres and Mitchell and the growing number of people who were listening to the conversation taking place beside the casket. Rodriguez wasn't just an elderly man who had wandered too close to the ceremony. He was someone whose life had been shaped by the woman they were honoring, someone who had taken that investment and used it to shape the lives of others. "She used to say that military music wasn't just about ceremony," Rodriguez continued. "She said it was about connection, about creating moments when people could feel the weight of service and sacrifice in a way that words alone couldn't capture. She understood that music could carry messages that were too important for speech." Mitchell picked up his bugle again, but this time his preparation was different. He wasn't just getting ready to perform a ceremonial duty. He was preparing to deliver a message that connected decades of service and mentorship and love. He was preparing to play taps not just for General Hawkins, but for the man who had taught him that every note mattered. "Would you like to play it together, Sergeant Major?" Mitchell asked, offering Rodriguez a second bugle that had been brought as a backup instrument. Rodriguez looked at the instrument, then at Mitchell, then at the casket where General Hawkins lay in state. His hands, which had been gripping the rail for support, reached out to accept the bugle with the reverence of someone handling a sacred object. "I haven't played in years," Rodriguez said quietly. "It's like riding a bicycle, Sergeant Major," Mitchell replied. "Some things you never forget." What happened next was something that no amount of military protocol could have planned or predicted. Two buglers, separated by decades of age and experience, but connected by a shared understanding of what music meant in moments of grief and honor, played taps together. The younger man's notes were crisp and technically perfect, trained through years of military ceremony. The older man's notes were softer, more tentative at first, but carrying the weight of 40 years of experience and the emotion of saying goodbye to someone who had changed his life. The chapel fell silent as the familiar notes of taps filled the space, but this wasn't the routine performance of a ceremonial duty. This was something more profound, more personal, more connected to the individual lives that had been touched by the woman they were honoring. It was a musical conversation between past and present, between teacher and student, between two men who understood that some honors transcend protocol. As the final notes faded into silence, Rodriguez handed the bugle back to Mitchell with hands that were no longer trembling. The tears on his face were still visible, but they seemed different now, less about grief and more about gratitude. He had been given the opportunity to say goodbye in a way that honored both his relationship with General Hawkins and his commitment to the young man he had taught to play. Torres, who had initially been concerned about maintaining protocol, found himself understanding that he had witnessed something more important than military regulations. He had seen the moment when rigid adherence to rules gave way to recognition of human connection, when the letter of the law bowed to the spirit of service that military ceremony was meant to honor. As Rodriguez finally stepped back from the casket, Torres didn't escort him away. Instead, he walked beside him, offering the support of one service member to another, understanding that some moments require flexibility in the face of something larger than protocol. The ceremony continued, but it had been transformed by the recognition that military honor isn't just about following rules, but about understanding the human connections that give those rules meaning. The story of Sergeant Major Rodriguez and Corporal Mitchell spread beyond that chapel, beyond that cemetery, beyond that day. It became a reminder that the most meaningful moments in military service often happen when protocol makes room for humanity, when regulations bend to accommodate the deeper values they're meant to protect. Rodriguez returned to his seat in the back of the chapel, but he was no longer invisible. People understood now that he wasn't just an elderly man who had attended the funeral of a general. He was part of a chain of service and mentorship that connected generations of soldiers, a living example of how one person's investment in another could ripple forward through decades of service and sacrifice. Mitchell completed his performance of taps, but it carried different weight now. It wasn't just the ceremonial conclusion of a military funeral. It was the culmination of a relationship that had begun with a 14-year-old boy and his grandfather's trumpet and had grown into something that transcended the boundaries of age and rank in time. The funeral of General Patricia Hawkins was remembered not just for its perfect execution of military protocol, but for the moment when protocol itself was challenged and transformed by something more important than regulations. It was remembered as the day when a young military policeman learned that some honors transcend rules, when a bugler had the opportunity to honor the man who had taught him to play, and when an elderly sergeant major was given the chance to say goodbye to someone who had changed his life. Sometimes the most important lessons in military service aren't found in manuals or regulations. Sometimes they're found in the moments when rigid adherence to protocol gives way to recognition of the human connections that give military service its meaning. Sometimes honor isn't about following rules perfectly, but about understanding when something more important than rules is at stake. This story was brought to you by the Veteran Voices. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who invested in others without expecting anything in return, who taught you something that changed your life? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how their investment shaped who you became. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.